Welcome to Biogeochemistry Breakdown. My name is Christine Kitchens, and I'm a research technician at the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research. I'm here to help explain some of the more complicated ideas within Great Lakes science. Today, we're going to talk about the story of hypoxia. However, before we can talk about hypoxia, first we need to talk about oxygen. You know oxygen is important for animals, including people. We need to breathe oxygen to live. It turns out a lot of animals in the water need to breathe oxygen too, including fish, aquatic insects, mussels, and teeny tiny animals called zooplankton. When we talk about the amount of oxygen in the water, we call it dissolved oxygen, or DO.
Why don't we talk a little bit more about dissolved oxygen so that we can make sure everyone understands?
Well, think of it this way. When you take sugar and mix it into water, even if you can't see the sugar anymore, you know it's still in the water. It's just become dissolved in the water. It turns out oxygen in the air can do the same thing. There are a few different things that affect how much dissolved oxygen is in the water. For example, temperature plays a big role in how much dissolved oxygen water can hold. You can dissolve more oxygen in cold water than in warm water. We also tend to find a lot of dissolved oxygen where there's a lot of moving water, like in fast-moving streams. This is because moving water encourages oxygen in the air to become dissolved in water. Finally, another big source of dissolved oxygen in the water are teeny tiny plants called phytoplankton, or algae. Even though I call them tiny plants, it's more accurate to think of phytoplankton as microbes, in that many are the size of a single cell, and you need a microscope to see them, just like with bacteria. Like plants that grow on land, phytoplankton get their food by photosynthesis, which means that they feed themselves using sunlight. The process of photosynthesis doesn't just feed plants, it also creates oxygen.
We've been talking a lot about dissolved oxygen, but what about what we were talking about in the beginning, hypoxia?
Well, let's take a look at this scene. It's springtime in the Great Lakes. The water is cold, and the extra rain and melting snow are causing rivers and streams to come flowing into the lakes. The rivers and streams aren't just bringing extra water to the lake, they're also bringing nutrients, which you can think of as fertilizer for phytoplankton. In the same way putting fertilizer on your lawn or in your garden causes grass to grow and flowers to bloom, nutrients in the lake cause phytoplankton to grow. So the water is cold, we have a lot of wind and waves moving it around, and we have a lot of extra nutrients, which means a lot of happy phytoplankton. What does that mean for the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water? Right. All these things together mean that, in the springtime, there is a lot of dissolved oxygen in the water. In the summer, we have a very different situation in the lake. First, there don't tend to be as many storms, and the water doesn't move as much. Second, remember how we talked about all of the nutrients that washed into the lake during the springtime? All of those extra nutrients in the water mean that phytoplankton tend to grow a lot in the summertime. Finally, and most importantly, as the hot summer sun starts to warm up the surface water, colder water starts to sink to the bottom. This is because hot and cold water have different densities. In other words, the cold water is heavier than the warm water. As the surface water warms, but the bottom water doesn't, you eventually have two distinct layers of water: the warm surface water and the cold bottom water. Now, remember all that phytoplankton growing? There comes a point when that phytoplankton starts to sink to the bottom of the lake, and some of it dies there. At the bottom of the lake, there are lots of bacteria that eat all those dead phytoplankton. Actually, those bacteria eat up anything that sinks to the bottom of the lake. However, those bacteria use up oxygen as they eat dead phytoplankton and animals. Normally, this lost dissolved oxygen can be replaced by the oxygen mixed into the water from the atmosphere. But remember those two layers of water? It turns out that where those layers meet is like a wall, and oxygen can't get mixed into the bottom water. Okay, well, we can't get oxygen from the atmosphere, but what about the phytoplankton that's still alive in those bottom waters? Don't they produce oxygen too? It turns out the places where those cold bottom waters tend to form don't tend to get a lot of sunlight, and therefore not a lot of photosynthesis. So phytoplankton are not replenishing the oxygen. As a result, the oxygen keeps getting lower and lower until there's little or none at all. A lot of animals live in these bottom waters, so when dissolved oxygen gets low, they get pretty stressed out. Some organisms can tolerate the low amount of oxygen. Of those that can't, some are able to escape the low oxygen bottom waters by pushing past that invisible wall and finding safety in the oxygen-rich surface waters. However, not all of those animals are capable of leaving the sediment or can't tolerate the warm surface water beyond that invisible wall, and, as a result, may end up dying due to not having enough oxygen. The word we use to describe these low oxygen conditions is hypoxia, and it happens in a few places in the Great Lakes. The largest of those places is the central basin of Lake Erie. Each year, hypoxic zones can cover areas that are thousands of square kilometers big. In many years, hypoxia covers 4,000 square kilometers at some point, which is bigger than the state of Rhode Island. Sorry, Rhode Island. Not only that, but because of wind and waves, these zones of hypoxia can even move around. You've seen how these hypoxic zones can stress wildlife out, but they can also cause other problems, like turning your drinking water yellow. That's a whole separate topic, but hopefully you can see why hypoxia can be problematic for people who get their water from the Great Lakes and play in the Great Lakes. Now that you've learned the story of hypoxia, you understand why scientists in the Great Lakes want to study and understand when and where it happens. To learn how scientists at Sigler and our partners are studying hypoxia, check out our website. See you next time!